Because again, when you're trying to do it all by yourself and you don't have the bandwidth and the resources and the systems down in place, you can burn out. But if you go in and guest on other people's shows, what this does for you is it allows you to still have the end result in mind. So you know that if I'm going to go guest on a show, I'm going to be talking about these things. And I eventually want that person to be thinking about me when they need my offer or my service. It's a little strategic if you think about podcasting in the sense of go guest on other people's shows. Like stop stressing about the headache of doing it all by yourself. Go partner with other people that are creating it and go be a good podcast guest and help them promote their show.
Hey, Entreleaders, happy Wednesday, and welcome to another episode of the Leaders Lab podcast. If you are new to the DCTV community, I am your host, Dr. Charity C. Campbell, better known as Dr. C, and I'm a doctor of management, a world-class millennial global leader, an academic professional, and a multi-passionate entrepreneur. Now, here in the Leaders Lab, we talk all things Entreleadership, which is entrepreneurship and leadership components combined, communication, and balance as a millennial professional. And in today's episode, our special guest is here to help us understand how to cultivate community with your podcast audience and guests to skyrocket your growth. Now, for those of you who are like, really? I'm going to listen to a podcast episode today about doing this with a podcast. Absolutely, because there's so many of you right now who are still sitting on your podcast, meaning you know you're supposed to do it, but you haven't created it yet. And we are coming for you today, okay? We are coming for you. We're going to step all on those toes of yours. And I'm really excited about our very special guest. You know, for over 2 decades, our guest, Erica Castner, has helped business owners and personal brands expand their reach and their online presence. And she is also the host of the Voices of Impact podcast and recently became an Ironman. Now, you know, we're going to ask her about that because some of you might be thinking Marvel.
I'm going to jump in here. My niece thinks that, but no, I'm kidding. Yeah, she totally was like, what? You're going to be a Marvel character? I'm like, no. That's not how that goes down.
Yes, we have the Iron Man Nisha here today. Okay. We have her here. So Entreleaders, as you can see, she is beautiful. She is wonderful. I love her personality already. Please help me welcome to the Leaders Lab, Erica Castner. Welcome to the Leaders Lab, dear.
Thanks, Dr. C. What is up? I'm so pumped about this chat today. Let's do it. So
I love it. So first of all, podcasting. When did you get started? Like, what was the thing for you that said, you know what? I need to start a podcast?
Yeah. So I'm going to circle back to 2014. My husband and I were at it was a part personal development, part professional development workshop. And we were learning about all these opportunities to take what we love in our passions and how to monetize that stuff. And we really didn't go in with any expectation other than to just maybe learn some skill sets. I was getting ready to start my business. And so that was my motivation. My husband, he was going to stay in his same industry. So he was really there for moral support. But that weekend at that conference, I heard somebody speak from stage, and I can't remember this cat's name at this point in the juncture, but he was very instrumental. I wish I did, because he was very instrumental in helping me think about this podcasting medium, which I had never thought about. Now, at the time in 2014, I was dabbling in some video. So I was doing it was crazy because I literally pulled out my Android tablet at the time in my car. It was Hot Mess Express. I had my angles all off, but I was doing video and I was scared to death about it. But I thought this podcasting element could be really cool in terms of talking to an audience without having to show my face on camera, but to really connect with people in a way that was more organic and that was more connected to some of the things that I was passionate about, but then obviously helping people as well too. So I thought that was like in 2014, and within 3 weeks, I had already had some of my podcasting accounts set up. I was ready to go, and I was terrible at first, but here it is as we're recording this. It's 7.5 years later, and I've learned a lot along the ways. I've learned how to leverage other people's platforms to get my message out there, and I'm sure we'll talk all about these things today in terms of how it's going to cultivate community. But that's where it all started, was back in 2014 when I knew nothing about podcasting.
So you got started, and 7. Man, do you oof. So okay. Can we get a play-by-play, like a year, like what is it? Is a year-by-year play? Basically, what was like that first to maybe year 1 to year 3 like, and then year 4, year 5, year 6, and now you're at, year 7.5. What was it like each year? Like, did you have people who were listening, they were tuning in, they were, or was it like, I'm just showing up and I really don't know how many people I have? Like, what was it like?
Yeah, so let me back up for just a second. So
Okay.
I had been in my local market. So I live in Southwest Florida, and I have been in Southwest Florida since 2005. And
Okay.
that is where I really started getting into the service-based world. The first 11 years of my career were up in Illinois, predominantly in the retail space. And when I moved to Florida in 2005, I wanted a new challenge. And so I had an opportunity to work for a couple local chambers of commerce. And that's how I really got into this business space and business development
Okay.
space, and understanding the power of connecting with people. And I was never
Mm.
thinking about it in a digital capacity, especially back in 2005, because that really didn't exist. I mean, I think you had
Right,
MySpace back
right.
in the day, but like, let's be real. I mean,
Yeah.
none of the things that we know today didn't exist back then. So it was really
Right.
about cultivating those relationships in person. And then, so if we flip forward to 2014, 2015, when I launched the podcast, the operative word I want everybody to kind of phrase, I want everybody to kind of pay attention to is I had a base of a network. I had people that already knew, liked,
Mm.
and trusted me. And when I started a podcast, people were, oh, okay, you're doing this thing and we want to listen, we want to tune in. But it wasn't just easy peasy. Like, I wasn't like I could just be like, oh, I have all these friends and I'm just going to bank on the fact that they're all going to download it. And the point of all of this today is, in the beginning days of my podcasting, I started doing it based on the things that I thought my audience wanted. And I started getting burnt out because I was creating all of these ideas and the content by myself. And it wasn't until
Mm.
I literally sunsetted that podcast. So that was the title's not relevant because it's not published. But and so between 2015 and 2016, I literally did that podcast. I stopped it. I rebranded essentially the podcast in 2016, still with this anticipation that I was doing. I had guests on the show, but again, I was crafting all of this by myself. I got
Yeah.
so burnt out. So by the time 2017 rolled around, I was like, you know what? I think it's just better if I like be on other people's podcasts, because I know what I want to talk about. And I know that there's an audience with the things I want to talk about, but it's more strategic for me to get out there and talk to other people's audiences. And when I did
Wow.
that, Dr. C, what was funny was I started learning because I was talking to other people. I was engaging in people that were already creating content. I was
Mhm.
adding value to my existing network because I was inviting people that they didn't know existed. So by
Yeah.
me, like, again, being featured on these people's shows, I was now like being interviewed with all these different people, and now my network could understand who these people were. I
Mhm.
started having discussions with these hosts and started realizing that there is an opportunity for me to create some content, but I need to get other people involved. So in 2019, I got back behind the hosting mic again, and
Mhm.
did my own, podcast, which is what is known today as the Voices of Impact. But the big
Mhm.
shift that I want everybody to pay attention to is that when you're trying to create content by yourself, it is
Oof.
a much harder thing to figure out. But when you can engage people
Yes.
in the process, they're more connected to it and they're more likely to pay attention and listen and engage because they're bought in, they're part of the process. So if you're freaking out about figuring it all out by yourself, the biggest thing you could do is go out there and solicit people's advice. Ask
Yeah.
people, what do you want? Oh, how can I help you? What topics are going to be relevant for you? And when they vote in on what they want, they're more likely to pay attention.
I love it. And it's so true. When you're trying to come up with everything on your own, you're like, okay, what should I talk about now? I mean, honey,
Yeah.
you have to do the research, whether you're going to do it through survey polling, search engine optimization, like, hitting up Google, YouTube, Pinterest, typing in the search what you think, your
Yeah.
audience wants to hear. Auto populations, when it just comes up
Yeah,
like
when you're
trying to
like
finish
putting
off your
something in a search
sentences.
bar, right? Is that what you're talking
That's
about?
what yes, that's what people wanna know because they've already submitted it to, the search engine asking about that thing. So that's, that's another one of the ways. That's one of my secrets actually. I don't know if you do that. Do you do that?
With keyword search, so I used to back in the day, especially when I was launching this new podcast. And one of the
Mm.
cool things that I did with this, what I say new podcast, but now it's 3 years old. But when I launched
Mhm.
it in 2019, I was literally right down to the cover art. Right, I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. Like, what picture should I pick? Girl, I had within minutes, I had like hundreds of people being like, girl, you look good in this one. I hate this one, but pick this one. And so I didn't care what it was. I didn't necessarily look at that feedback and be like, oh, they said they didn't like this photo. I didn't judge it. I was just like, look, it's engagement. They know it's coming. And
Yes.
so they're
Oh
prepared
my
for it when it officially launches, when I did launch it. And then I
God.
included them in on the process along the way. So I didn't just stop at the cover art and the name of it. I also said, these are some topics I'm thinking about. What is the next thing I should record on? Then I had a flood of
Wow.
comments that would come in and be like, okay, this is what you need to talk about, or can you talk about this? And so then I would get a whole lot of other ideas on what I could talk about next. So it was those kinds of things that really helped bring in my audience and bring in my network to drive the downloads to my podcast.
Now, you mentioned that you were on other people's podcasts, bringing value to them, and they were bringing value to you because you were learning in the process. What's the most important factor that podcasters should consider when they are seeking guests for their podcast?
Well, at the end of the day, you have to decide what's the narrative that you're trying to share with your existing audience. So, if it makes sense
Mhm.
to bring in, for me personally, I love being able to. I talk a lot about how to position the voice that you have. So, I feel that a lot of people that are listening to my show, they are showing up in impactful ways, and they have a
Yeah.
voice. They're trying to position it, and so I talk about those things, but then they need to know people that will supplement their journey along the way that I can't help them with. So I'm going to invite people like yourself, right? We'll have to have you on my show at some point because you're a perfect fit for
Yes.
what I'm doing in terms of stepping into
Love
that
it.
leadership role. But
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not content creators, but course creators. I don't write people's courses, but do I help position them and help content or course creators figure stuff out? Sure. But is somebody out there in my network, do they need to know somebody that helps people create courses? Absolutely. So it's an
Wow.
understanding your audience and then saying from your guest perspective, how do you invite people that are the 3 to 5 industries that are likely already talking and marketing to your customer? And then how do you
Yeah.
co-create content so that you could mutually benefit each other's audiences? So
I
that's
love it.
been the really strategic way I've been able to do that. And again, leverage what I'm doing with their audience and vice versa. They're able to shine on my platform and be a beacon of hope for somebody that needs their services in my audience.
I love it so much. So then, how can podcasters effectively engage their audience to maximize the growth of their podcast while they're having, these other speakers come, or it's, to participate, or while they're gaining these mutually beneficial exchanges? How can podcasters effectively engage their current audience to maximize the growth? I mean, because obviously we want our podcast to grow. Like, we don't want to keep talking, don't get this wrong. Don't get me wrong, entre leaders, when I say this, because I'm not meaning it that way. I was about to say we don't want to keep talking to the same, few people over and over. We will talk to you as much as we need to, honey. We love you. We love you. But we also want to expand
Yeah,
our
for sure.
reach.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
how?
So it's twofold because your guest, depending again, if they're aligned with the going back to my scenario and saying that if you're connecting with people that are talking and marketing, like the 3 to 5 industries, I should say, that are likely talking and marketing to your ideal customer as a host, then you are automatically going to start opening and expanding your reach because now you're inviting these other people that have a similar vibe to your
Yeah.
audience. And then
Mhm.
the other side of this is to find a way to create a community. So one of the things that we did, and we did it for a long time, and then I ran out of bandwidth, and I unfortunately had to shut it down. But we revamped some things to kind of bring it back to the ecosystem, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of the things that we did right in the beginning was we literally had a community of a social media community on Facebook that literally anybody that listened to the Voices of Impact podcast, they had to listen to the podcast to know to jump into that community. And so at one point we had about 1,700 people in that community. Now, in all respects, there there were people that were in my current network that I knew that I had connected, obviously guests that were on the show, people that were friends of theirs on the show. So we had all of that going on. It got to be to a point where our staff couldn't manage 1,700 people, and nor do you want to manage a community. If you're not fully staffed, it can be a big monster to manage a free community. So one of the things that we started doing recently was we have now anybody that's wanting to create, like our female creators, right? So our female creators who are more than likely speaking, doing podcasts, doing video creation, creating blogs, they're creating content. We have now something called the Speakers and Podcasters Collaborate community. So we invite them into that process. And again, part of it is the only way you can get access to it is if you're listening to me on a show or if you're listening to my podcast. And so it's a great way for people to engage with what I'm doing, to stay connected, because eventually, and to meet other guests, because we do have live events once a month. We do have a freemium option with that group that if they want to meet fellow listeners, that we offer that once a month. So it's an opportunity for those of you who are trying to monetize a free community, create a free community that makes sense for your efforts. But then what's that little thing that you can add in your community that they have to opt in for it doesn't have to be expensive. I think right now they currently paid like $99 a year to join that community. It doesn't have to be super expensive, but it's a opportunity for them to jump in and connect with people. And that's that added value that you're connecting your audience with other people that they need to meet. So that's a way that you can do that as well, to grow the audience and to maintain the integrity of those relationships with your guest.
Yeah. Now you actually just snuck in something that I was really hoping that we would get to in today's episode. And this is a selfish question, but I'm sure it applies to other people. How do you monetize your podcast?
Yeah. So again, one of the things that I specifically do is I do not have a sponsorship ad. There are plenty of people out there that, play into the sponsorship role. And I get it. I totally understand it. I get it. We're not there. And there's obvious reasons for that, because it's just a lot to manage and a lot to deal in terms of personalities and what that entails. Yeah. So one of the things that the true and tried way that I have done it since day one is we're literally using it as a vehicle to promote services and programs that I offer. And so it's an and then my affiliates too. So like, let's just say that I happen to have an affiliate on as a guest. Of course, we're disclosing that in the interview, but it allows us to, again, monetize what we're doing because we're putting front and center. And it's not the whole episode. It's literally dropping in nuggets and dropping in like, hey, this is what's coming up around the bend. Join here, opt in. Here's the freebie that's going to lead to this next thing. But that's how we've been able to do it, is through, again, listening to our audience. Again, it goes back to, if you're dialed into your audience and you're letting them tell you on some level what they need, then your podcast content and let's just say you're guesting on other people's shows, that content can lead people right up to what you need to do in terms of your own service offerings. So making sure that those are front and center, and you might have to offer a freebie. I like, most people aren't going to just, like, if you're listening to me for the first time, you're probably not going to jump into my $99 community. Like, I don't care how sexy it is, you're probably not going to do it. But do you want to go check out the free version of my community? Probably. And so that's the opportunity to do it. But you have to build that know, like, and trust factor in steps. And that's how we've been able to do it, is giving people an opportunity to jump in and learn more about our programs and services through, like, the free communities that we're creating and some of these lower ticket offers before they jump into some of these, bigger offers that we have throughout the year.
Good deal. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So then you go through, all of this. You have a lot that you've done so far. You are networking, collaborating, building communities, right? You're doing all the things, bringing people back to your sites or your lead magnets, your freebies. I want to know, throughout this whole process, what do you do to keep your guests engaged with, with your productions, with your hard-earned work, everything that we do? after the episode is published? Like, how do you continue to have them engage after the episode?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And one of the things that has really served me well, and this is something that I've learned over time, it wasn't something I implemented right out the gate. I had to learn it
Okay.
as I went. But when I shifted the onboarding process of my podcast just this year, so one of the things that we did was, and I say we because I have a small production team that helps me pull some of these things together, because I do
Okay.
have to sleep sometimes. But anyway, I digress. So one of the
Mhm.
things that we did was we created the only way they could be on the podcast with me as a guest is they needed to have a quick 15-minute pre-chat with me so that we could get crystal clear on what their topic was, what their goals were, and how to really make the show banging. Like how to make it so that they were hitting their objectives and that it was meeting the needs of my audience too. And a
Okay.
lot of times what I was finding was when people were applying to be a guest on my show, no offense to them, but they were giving me topics that were really generic. And me as a podcast host, when I'm trying to think about X amount of spots to fill, I need to be very specific about I need to know very specifically what they're trying to talk about. And so we
Yeah.
were missing the mark. I mean, 90% of the applications that were coming through were very basic titles. And I also was like, I'm not going to have a basic bitch show. I'm just not going to do it. Like, I don't have the energy
Yeah.
for that. I ain't going to roll with that. And it's not fair to the guest either if I'm already coming with that energy. It doesn't serve them in terms of the audience experience and how their experience is for that guest. So what we ended up doing was we created these pre-chats, and again, asked them qualifying questions to just make sure that it was meeting the needs of my audience, but it was also meeting their goals as well too. Because when we're creating content, we want to be sure that it's a mutual thing and it's not this one-sided opportunity. And
Absolutely.
we were getting better topic titles from this little 15-minute pre-chat. By the time they rolled around and had a chat with me 3 weeks later or whenever they scheduled the interview, they were already comfortable with me because they already had a conversation with me. And so then if I had to jump into their inbox and share something else with them, they were more receptive to that. And it's more about building that, again, that ladder of that relationship, not with the intention of that I'm going to like necessarily gain them as a client one day, but like, how can we continue the partnership? We spend so much time tracking down guests. And if we don't do anything to connect with them in the future, like that was just it was a wasted space. You know, it's never going to be a fruitful thing if you don't continue to nurture that relationship. And there's lots of systems and things like that. We talk about that. And like, there's actually a lesson I'm getting ready to do inside of the free community for the speakers and podcast Collaborate community on this very thing in terms of deep diving into like, what does that look like? And how do we structure that in a way so we can continue to develop that relationship? But that first piece of that is really finding a way to connect with them up front, so that when you jump onto that podcast interview, you all are rock solid. You know exactly what they're there for. They know exactly what you're there for. And you guys can have an amazing show, not just for you, the two of you, but then also for your audience.
Okay. At any point in time, did you ever feel like I'm talking about now, within the last year, since the pandemic, have you ever felt like this, this isn't easy? And I just
all the time.
I want to
all the time. But go ahead and finish your question, because I want to make sure that I'm answering it in a way that makes sense for where you're going with this.
Well, no, I was going to say, how do you keep yourself from quitting? Basically because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work. And oh my goodness, if you choose to also have a video version of your podcast, like moi, if you have the audio plus the video version and then you edit all of it yourself, it can be overwhelming. So how do you manage overwhelm? How do you manage the overwhelm of it all?
So I do have the fortunate pleasure of having a small team. And when I say small, I'm literally saying they're super part-time. I have a part-time editor that will take care of any of the editing aspects. They'll sometimes step in with show notes. And we have somebody that helps me coordinate guests. I still do, I do all the pre, interviews. I don't leave that up to somebody else. I still want to own that, because again, I want to own that relationship and I want to build that relationship.
Yeah.
But the element of the overwhelm aspect of it is that if you're clear about your goals, like if you know what your end result is as a podcast host, I know what my end result is as a podcast host. I mean, will I get there every single time? No, but I'm very clear about what that is and it starts with knowing that end result. So for those of you who are listening today right now, and let's just say that you're starting a podcast, I'm going to play this two-way, Dr. C. Okay. Can I do that? Okay.
Yeah.
The first
ahead.
way is if you're a podcast host and you're wanting to, maybe you're not there yet and you're wanting to launch the podcast, you have to know what's the end result of this. Is this because I want to use this as a platform to let people know about my programs and services or my whatever it is that I'm selling? If that's the case, what is the value ladder? Like reverse engineer that value ladder that the audiences and the guests are going to need to know so that when you're engaging either in your solo shows or your guest shows, everybody's on the same page with that. And that you have like at least a somewhat of a system down. It doesn't have to be poly perfect. Mine certainly wasn't when I first started podcasting, but I did know back in the day that I needed to know my end result. And so I was also, again, you heard my struggle with just creating it all by myself back in the day. But then when I started implementing other players in the mix, that helped me kind of take away some of the overwhelm. As a guest, now here's where I'm going to challenge your audience to stop thinking about, oh, I need to start a podcast. I need to start a podcast. I would much rather, if I had to do it all over again, Dr. C, if I'm going to be totally honest, I would completely not have to deal with my own podcast at all because it is a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort from me. I would probably right out the gate started with guesting. I wouldn't have even entertained the thought until I had a bigger team. Because again, when you're trying to do it all by yourself and you don't have the bandwidth and the resources and the systems down in place, you can burn out. But if you go in and guest on other people's shows, what this does for you is it allows you to still have the end result in mind. So you know that if I'm going to go guest on a show, I'm going to be talking about these things. And I eventually want that person to be thinking about me when they need my offer or my service.
Yes.
But then you could go on to multiple podcasts. You could go on to 40 podcasts a year, talk about the same thing over and over and over again. It's always going to feel fresh because the interviewer is going to be different. Your thoughts around it are going to feel different. And that audience is going to be exposed to it differently. And even if somebody in your audience has heard you talk about that topic before, again, it's going to feel fresh. It's going to feel reinvigorating. It's going to remind them. So it's a little strategic if you think about podcasting in the sense of go guest on other people's shows. Like stop stressing about the headache of doing it all by yourself. Go partner with other people that are creating it and go be a good podcast guest and help them promote their show. Help them create the audience because they're working their tails off to make it happen. So go be a good podcast guest, and give them awesome information and then help them promote their show. Be a good friend to them.
Now that is... Listen, now for all of you out there who already have your podcast equipment and you've been giving yourself an excuse as to why you can't start your own, she just demolished your excuse. She literally tore up the excuse and the box it was delivered in by telling you, no, you don't have to have your own. Go and help someone else build their audience. Because remember, when you help somebody else to build theirs, it's mutually beneficial. Like somebody's going to see you and recognize you. Like they have to because you're present as well. So, don't think it's okay.
And here's the thing. I'll say something that I'll touch on what you just shared there, Dr. C. So when I took that break between 2017 and 2019, I was lighting up with the guest route. That was all I was doing, was guesting on other people's podcasts. And I still would have people that ran into me at networking events or around town, and they'd be like, oh, I heard your podcast the other day. Child, they didn't hear my podcast. They heard somebody else's podcast, but they heard me on the show. So that's how ingrained it was in their brain that I was out there, I was visible, but it wasn't my own show. It was somebody else's.
Wow.
So your audience isn't even like thinking about it in the realm of like, oh, that's not her podcast. They just see you and they assume it's your podcast.
What about when people want to be on your show, but you don't have one? Like you went on theirs,
Yeah,
and they're like, oh, okay, well, hey, let me know when I can be on yours. And you're like, oh yeah,
about that.
yeah. See, what had happened was, so
Yeah.
what about that? What about that?
That is such a great question. So there's a few ways we could play this. I'm only gonna maybe dive into one or two, but the
That's fine. Yeah.
easiest way that you can roll with this is if you don't have a show that you can offer a spot onto your platform, go be the connector. Be like, hey, I was on so and so show the other day. If that's what you want to do is be on other people's shows, like you need to go talk to this person over here. Let me connect the two of you because
Wow.
you're all hanging out and you're talking about the same thing, similar things, not the same things, but I think that you could be a good asset to what they're looking for in terms of guests. So
Yeah.
that's how you add value to somebody else's world by if you don't have a platform that you're creating, go be the intro person and say, look, I have 40 people that I was just featured on this year. Go check out, like, who do you need to meet? And I'm happy to play connect the dots. So that is probably the easiest way you could do it. And then today with social media, there's lots of platforms out there today, with Instagram Live and LinkedIn Live, and there's a bunch of others too, but those are the two that kind of come to mind. You could, in theory, create content through that platform. So it doesn't have to necessarily be you starting from scratch and trying to do all the things related to your podcast, but you can co-create content on some of these other social media platforms. The only caveat that I have to that is that you don't own those platforms. So if something happens to those platforms, it goes away. But if you're trying to do something to spice it up a little bit and create a little bit of synergy, that's another way to go about it as well.
I love it. And you said one of the things that I hosted a coaching group in 2020, which I've been trying to decide if I want to do it again this year. It's only in the fourth quarter. I've been trying to decide if I want to bring it back for 2022. I didn't do it 2021, but I always tell them, I said, if Facebook, because everybody's on Facebook, Lord have mercy, I'm actually getting ready to get off Facebook. But, I said, if Facebook shut down today, what would happen to all of your contacts? I'm not talking about the friends. Okay. I'm not talking about the friends list. I mean, all of the contacts, the people who actually engage with your content. They are the ones who you can post anything and they are always going to respond to you just because they have that connection with you. What if social media, all of them, what if social media shut down today? Where will your people go?
Yeah.
And first of all, if
go ahead, jump in.
Down, I was going to say, and if it did shut down, then I'm sure there would be panic all over the place, but still, where would your people go? You have to have a house to bring them to, and so that's why I always tell them, get a website. Like your website is the thing that you will always control that. You will always own that.
Yeah. And email, like that's why it's so important for people to develop their email list and build that list, because it's an opportunity for them to market to people, and you own that. You don't necessarily own social media platforms. So if you're not working on building your list, it's a tricky thing, because you've got to make sure that you're being compliant. And now there's all these laws, thankfully so, but you got to make sure that you have some of those ducks in a row. But if you don't know how to figure that out, the good news is that there's other people that I'm sure Dr. C is bringing onto the show, other experts that you can glean into, either learn how to do it through a do-it-yourself course, or make some investments in making that happen, because the success of your business growth relies on some of these tools to be in place in order for you to continue that success.
Absolutely. So before I ask you the final question, the same one that I ask everyone when they come to the Leaders Lab, I want to know, is there anything else that you feel like our listeners should hear today? Like, is there anything else that you want to share that you're like, before I leave the Leaders Lab, I need them to know this?
Yeah. So as we're talking about cultivating relationships, the biggest thing, regardless if you're creating your own podcast, going to be a guest on other people's podcasts, you're going to use another way to build your audience. Remember that first and foremost, that the numbers in your audience actually represent people. And when you are paying attention to the people in your audience, and you're more focused on the people that you touch, and not in a superficial way, but you're literally reaching out, having conversations with people, then those are the things that count. Those are the things that add up in other people's banks of influence and spheres of influence and their eyes on you. So don't get caught up in the vanity likes and the vanity shares, because none of that stuff matters when people don't know who you are. So at the end of the day, we could talk all these strategies about, how to leverage podcasts and how to be a guest and how to do whatever you want to do in terms of building your audience. But at the end of the day, you have to remember that there's people behind those numbers. And if you're not connecting with those people or finding way to put them in a better place than you found them, then you're missing the boat. So just focus on that. I promise you, stuff will start figuring itself out when you can make the people the priority, and the rest of this stuff will sort itself out if you're making the people the priority.
All right. If you didn't know, now you know. If you didn't know, now you know. I love it. I love that very comprehensive answer. It was very clear, and it gave clear directives as to what to do. So thank you very much for that. All right, here's the big question. Here is the big question. We ask it to everyone. What is the number one characteristic that every leader must have?
Patience. Through and through. I would not be where I'm at today if I didn't have patience. And you have to understand that when we're talking about cultivating relationships, building this audience, it takes time. It's not something that happens just because you're a cute face, you got a hot message at the moment. It's going to take patience and your persistence. I think that's probably the other nugget that I'll slip in here.
Yeah.
Your persistence to say, you know what, I'm going to stick it out and do whatever. I know we didn't really touch on it today. You said this in the beginning of the interview with the Ironman bit. Let me kind of circle this into the mix. It's okay. I promise I'm gonna make this all full circle and make it make
Tanya
sense.
Tanya Starks, please explain to.
So I love how you switch that up.
Tanya Starks.
But I didn't know how to swim as we're recording this. I didn't know how to swim 3 years ago. And in order to be an Ironman, you have to swim 2.4 miles, you have to ride 112 miles on a bike, and you have to run a full marathon, a 26.2 mile marathon. All in one day. You got about 17 hours to do it. I didn't know how to swim. And so I was very frustrated because when I first started learning the quality of swimming, now first, I didn't even have any aspirations to do Ironman, let's be real. But I had to be so patient with my own ability and be willing to show up and do the work, even though I didn't know, I didn't know what was around the corner in terms of my abilities. So much like business, you've got to stick that out. You have to show up for practice. You have to be patient with the process, and you have to do the damn work. Like, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do that one day. You have to be in it now and doing it. But then again, when you're in that work, be patient with the results, because they will come when you're showing up consistently. And so I was able in 3 years, and everybody that knows me outside of this space, Dr. C, would have never bet on me to ever cross the Ironman finish line. Not even my own daddy, right? Not even my own daddy. Whatever. And he'll tell you that. I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about him. He'll tell you that point blank. No money on that chick to ever cross the Ironman finish line.
Wow.
What did I do? I showed up and did the work, and I was patient with the process, and we made it happen 3 years after I learned how to swim. So you all can do the same thing with your business. You got big vision with it. Don't quit. Be patient with the process and go knock it out of the park.
Yeah, I love it. Erica, this has been so fire today. I love it so much.
Same here.
Been sharing. You've been dropping gems and everything to all of our listeners and viewers here at the Leaders Lab podcast. Listen, I know that there's someone who's like, okay, I need to get in touch with her. How can the people contact you?
Thank you for that question. So the easiest way to connect with me would be heading on over to ericacastner.com/community. That's where you can learn more about the speakers and podcasters Collaborate community, if that's your boat. But if you're not ready for that and you want to just jam on some of the content that I'm creating over in that space, head on over to ericacastner.com/podcast.
I didn't know the forward, but you all can find it. You can find it. You can just go. You could just make sure you go there. And also, if you're watching the video version of this, you see that there's like a ticker that's going by that has all of her social media content up there, and also her email address. This can be found in the show notes for the audio version of the podcast, and also it can be found in the description box below this video. So wow, this has been awesome. Erica, this has been so great. I so appreciate you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to connect with you today, Dr. C. And I can't wait to have you on my show at some point. So we'll knock it out of the park and hit up our audience with all the gems that you're going to be like sharing on that episode.
You tell me when, baby. I am there, and we're gonna have to make sure that we have you back for season 3, which will be next year. So yes,
love it, awesome. Well, thank you again for the opportunity. You rock, my friend.
You are absolutely welcome. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you so much for rocking with us today for this very special episode of the Leaders Lab podcast. It truly does warm my heart that you all keep tuning in every single week. Like, you could be doing anything, you could be listening to anyone, but you choose to listen to the Leaders Lab podcast. And honestly, I know I joke a lot and I love to laugh and I love to play, but you guys have no idea just how fortunate I feel that you actually listen. You listen and you tune in to learn from me and my special guests. And I really hope that you continue to find the content that we bring here valuable and that it continues to help you in your journey to becoming a better leader. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the Leaders Lab podcast. You can download today's episode if you're listening to the audio version, and you can subscribe to DrCharityTV on YouTube. Make sure on whether you listen on Apple Podcasts, Google, Castbox, all of them, okay, because it's everywhere. So it's 14 or more. 14 or more channels with the podcast is at. Go up there and rate, comment, share so that we can continue reaching millennial global leaders all around the world. And don't forget that you can connect with me on social media everywhere at DrCharityTV. If you have any questions or you would like to be a guest on this show for season 3, don't forget, let me put it up here for you that you can contact me at the Leaders Lab podcast at DrCharityTV.com, and someone will respond to you in a timely manner. So listen, everyone, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in to this special episode of the Leaders Lab podcast, and I will catch you next week in the lab.
Thank you for listening to the Leaders Lab podcast. Visit our website at www.drcharitytv.com.